first and foremost, let's all just take a deep breath, center this up. This is a real important, beautiful, historic conversation for Sacramento. And before we get into, talking about the legacy and remembering Stephon, I want to actually really remember Stephon. So Stevante, before we talk policy or public response, I want you to begin with Stephon as a person. What do you most want people to remember about your brother that the headlines never captured?
His larger than life personality. He was just larger than life. He was a really great person. Everywhere he went, he lit the room up. I think people don't see that. I mean, they see pictures of him. He's beautiful and he got a nice smile and he's with his beautiful children. But Stephon was somebody who, he was so nice to people. He has a friend named Esme. She's in a wheelchair and he shows her so much love in high school. He gave her so much care that a guy walked up to me yesterday. He said, seeing your brother do that to her made me love better. And that was Stephon. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. I want to ask you one more question because it's been 8 years since your brother was killed. What does grief look like for you in the years since? And what do people often misunderstand about living with the loss like this?
I think people need to understand there's a difference between pain and mental health. And I think, passion with direction is chaos. I mean, without direction is chaos, and passion with direction is purpose. And I think when I jumped on the mayor's desk and all that, I was that passion, but no direction. That's why it was chaotic in the way it looked, in the way it was very chaotic. But I think now where I'm doing the Legacy Week, what we're doing with Stephon and all that, I think that's passion with direction, which is purpose.
Beautiful. Mr. Steinberg, when Stephon Clark was killed, Sacramento experienced a deep rupture of trust between many residents and the institutions meant to protect them. Looking back now, what did that moment reveal to you about the city you were leading?
Well, it revealed what I already knew, and I think a lot of people already knew, that Sacramento has always been the tale of two cities. I'll put it this way. Are we the city of trees, of tree-lined neighborhoods where some kids get shade? Or are we a city that has some wonderful history and tradition, but also a history of huge inequities and obvious discrimination? I think we focused Sacramento a lot on its sort of idyllic Midwestern feel, how friendly it is, and that's all true. But the other half of it is equally true. And that is we've built this city with some neighborhoods being redlined, with a long history of people of color being disenfranchised and discriminated against. And so to me, what happened in March of 2018, the Stephon and the community's reaction revealed something that was actually evident for a long, long time. The role of a city has to be, and city leadership has to be about more than just providing the basics. That's where you start. It has to be about addressing the conditions that lead to this kind of a tragedy. Not just police and communities of color, absolutely, but also economic inequity and hopelessness and what we have allowed to perpetuate in our city, and not just our city, cities throughout this country for too long.
This next one is for both of you. For many people in Sacramento, the protests that followed were painful, necessary, and transformative all at once. What did each of you believe that those protests were trying to tell the city?
Do you want me to go first? Or do you want to go first? Of course, there was more than one protest. I guess I want to say, and I don't know if it's part of the questioning, so I will take the question and talk about the importance of my friendship with Stevante and where we started, because that was seen nationally and internationally when a brother in the midst of grief jumped on the dais where I was presiding and said some unkind things to me. And we sit here today, 8 years later, but it didn't take 8 years. It was actually soon after And we became friends. And we became friends because I saw what was underneath that anger, by the way, appropriate anger, but what was underneath that anger. And that was a sweet man who was grieving for his brother and who wanted to make a positive difference in our community. And so not to overdo it, because, but I really think it's significant that we sit here today and that we became friends despite his anger at me, which was not really personal. I was the symbol of the city. And so maybe other people can look at that, and other communities can look at that and say that you should never give up on relationships. We should never give up on trying to understand one another. We should never give up on trying to cross the divide. That's powerful. And what you've done in this community, in my opinion, is powerful. The way you've taken pain and tragedy and tried to create something positive for your community. As for the protests, sorry, I know. I don't get many mics anymore. So, you give me a mic. This is, I got to hold on to it for a couple of minutes. Yeah. The protests were, depends which protests we're talking about. There were protests that were incredibly moving and meaningful to me. As much as after Stephon was killed, when George Floyd was murdered a couple years later. And sometimes they're too different, obviously, but it sort of all flows together a little bit for me. I remember when there was a die-in at my home with several thousand people laying down, and people said, well, were you scared? Were you offended? I said, no, I was moved. I was moved because people were speaking truth to power in a peaceful, nonviolent way. And I couldn't help but be affected by that. Now, there were other occasions where people threw rocks at my house and vandalized my home, masked people who didn't have the guts to actually want to be seen and talk to me like a human being. That I had less regard and respect for. I still think there's a lot to learn from Dr. King and the movement around the power of nonviolent, peaceful protest. And that's what Stephon has practiced, and that's what I think this is all about.
Stephon, what do you believe the protests were telling the city?
Fire and charge and convict the cops who murdered Stephon Clark.
Come on.
That's what I think they were trying to tell the city, is we don't want them killer cops on our street. I think they were trying to tell the city that Sac PD should know the difference between a gun and a cell phone. I think they were trying to tell the city that anytime you do something so bad where a law must be created, you should be held accountable. I think the protest was trying to tell the city that it was kind of weird for the DA at the time, Carol Ann-Marie Schubert-Baskins, was taking money, $13,000 days after, so I think the protests were coming from those types of situations. I think that's what people, but I think it's righteous anger. But I like the vandalizing, throwing rocks at cars. I remember there was a protest where cars were destroyed. That is, we don't rock with. That's not like, we practice the spirit of Dr. King when we go out there and protest. And that's why our theme for this year is Keep Hope Alive, in honor of Jesse Jackson. Our last year theme for the Legacy Weekend was Keeping the Dream Alive. So we honor peaceful protesting, but we understand why people protest. But protest without policy is just parade. We got to get some things done, after the protest. What are our actionable items? We protesting, but what are our solutions? What are we protesting for?
And, we did things at the city that I think were really important. And it's never enough, by the way, never enough. But and give Chief Hahn his kudos by releasing that video footage, not just for Stephon's killing, but for all officer-involved shootings, to release that video within 30 days or even sooner, to change the use of force policy, to bring the Attorney General in to look objectively at where the city needs to change. And then, of course, I was proud to be one of the only big city mayors to support AB 392, Dr. Weber's bill, the Stephon Clark Act, which changed the requirement around use of deadly force. It increased the threshold. It has to be a last resort, because it always has to be a last resort. And so good came out of terrible tragedy and continues to.
This next one's for Savante. When people speak about justice in cases like your brother's, the word can mean very different things. What would justice feel like for you today?
Well, yeah, that's a good one because I can't have Stephon Clark with me today. So I think justice for me today would be um, the officers turn themselves in for murder. I want some accountability, but justice is, I don't know, I think, once police kill over 1,000 people a year. The Black people are 28% of those killed by law enforcement. We're only 14% of the population, disproportionately killed higher than anybody on the planet. So I think, justice for me is no more Stephon Clark's, man. I think today, yeah.
It also means changing the way the police relate to the community. The movement which we were part of in Sacramento to start the Department of Community Response, which has been largely about homelessness, but ultimately is intended to be about alternative response to crises in our communities. That's the answer. We should not be putting police officers in situations that too often end in tragedy. If it's a mental health crisis, we ought to be consistently putting out mobile crisis teams and people who know how to de-escalate situations and can help the person who's struggling with their crisis. The fundamental nature of policing, I think, needs to change. And by the way, that's good for the police as well, because they ought to be enforcing the law. And when somebody's a victim of crime or when there's serious crime, that's where you need the police. But when it comes to situations that call for another kind of response, more effective response, that's what we need to move towards. I know Mayor Mondami in New York City's talking about that. We were one of the first to establish an alternative response system. And like I said, it's been mostly homelessness, but over time it ought to evolve to being in our community and allowing the police to back off from some of these situations.
This next one's for you, Mr. Steinberg. From your perspective as mayor, what responsibility does a city carry when a tragedy like this breaks the community's trust in law enforcement?
To do everything we can to rebuild trust. I mean, we did several things, and I know it's never enough, but we established the first inspector general here in Sacramento to actually independently investigate officer-involved shootings and report to the city manager and the city council about what they found, even if it's different from what internal affairs found. Now, has it worked out exactly the way I envisioned it? No. We have a form of government in the city where a mayor, frankly, is one vote among 9. The city manager runs the city. The mayor does not oversee the police department. These aren't excuses, but I look at in retrospect and say, could we have gone farther? Yes, of course. But we did establish the first independent inspector general. We did establish the Department of Community Response. We did change the use of force standards. And there were a lot of changes, but I think more than that, I think Stephon's death was part of redefining the responsibilities of a city and a city government. Cities traditionally have been about providing police, fire, water, utilities, and parks. That's no longer enough. We need an inclusive economic development strategy. And under my mayorship, we started that and we launched the Department of Economic Development. We invested more in South Sacramento and North Sacramento and Northgate than ever before. We invested in youth and in workforce training. And I'm not saying all this to say we didn't solve anything, but we laid a foundation. And if that foundation is grown and built upon, and a city sees as its responsibility investing in its communities, especially its disenfranchised communities, that's a key role for a city and city government. then change is possible.
For both of you, the night Stephon was murdered changed Sacramento forever. In what ways do you think the city is still living inside the shadow of that moment?
I don't know. March of 2018 will never be forgotten by this city or in this city. I think it changed our city forever. It exposed what was easy to see with more keen eyesight, that relationship between our police and our community, especially our communities of color, needs to continue to change and change for the better. That inequity is not to be looked at passively. It's to be actively changed. We may not be able to fix everything because a city can only do so much without a state and a federal government especially. It changed us forever. And hopefully the memory of Stephon and the continued advocacy of Stevante and his family and the community will hold all this generation and future generations of elected officials accountable to at least doing their very, very best to not forget people and neighborhoods that have been too long forgotten.
In what ways do you think the city is still living inside the shadow of that moment?
Man, that's a deep question, man. That's a deep question. I think I've always said slow progress is better than no progress, you know? And I think the story of Stephon Clark, Stephon is legend now, I believe. I think his initials, if you look at him, is SAC. I am SAC, the foundation, Stephon Alonzo Clark. If you look at the logo too, the city is on the underlining of it is downtown. The skyline is downtown and it's upside down. It's backwards because it symbolizes the blood dripping from the city. When Stephon died, I believe part of the city died. It's like the city killed the city. And I think for me, realizing that Stephon, it's bigger than Stephon. It hurts for me to say that 'cause that's my brother. But I understand that, we got the mother of Eric Garner here right now, So I know it's bigger than just Stephon Clark. That's why I think it's so important that his name is literally the city.
Absolutely. So healing is a word that we use often, but it can feel kind of abstract. What would real healing between communities and institutions look like in Sacramento?
Well, healing requires change. Healing requires systemic change. Healing requires a commitment to righting wrongs. And that's the evolution, I think, of our city and our society. I asked this question in 2008 in a speech. I'd like to repeat it again. Why should a third grader living in South Sacramento have any less of a chance of a good life than a third grader growing up in East Sacramento? That question should haunt us. We may never fully answer that question satisfactorily, but it's our job, whether we are community leader, elected official, to wake up every day and try to answer that question in the right way. That's what brings healing. To see progress, to see effort, and to see progress, real progress.
Yes. Repeat the question again.
What would real healing between communities and institutions actually look like in Sacramento?
I think we need to I think healing starts when we start having at least the listening and learning sessions where institutions can actually learn from people in their communities, or not even learn from them, just listen to people in their communities, and people in the community can learn from those in their institutions, learn how the city works, learn how the training works in the academy, and those people in those same institutions listen to the needs of the community, listen to what we want, listen to how we feel, just listen. I think if we have more listening and learning sessions to start bridging those gaps, to start, you know, too many neighborhoods, not enough neighbors. So I think that once we start getting to know each other and getting that village type feel back in our communities, then we can start talking about some transformative, restorative justice on a higher level. Because right now we ain't nowhere close.
So we've touched a little bit on the coming generations and the young people. The young people in Sacramento watched everything that happened. What message would each of you want to give to the next generation about how to pursue justice and change?
Should I go first? So I like something you said. I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't think I say it exactly, but anger, no matter how justified, is not enough. Has to be anger combined with purpose and with strategy. And I saw the difference. I see what Stevante has done with his pain. He's organized. I experienced a lot of anger without purpose as well. And there is a difference. And so for young people, several things. Number one, it's worth it. Get involved, get engaged. You can help change part of the world. Secondly, don't let your anger be decoupled from strategy to make the change that you want to see. And three, don't be a short timer. Don't flit in and out. Realize how hard it is, because it is hard to make change, and then go away frustrated. Be in it for the long term and measure your success and your progress by looking back over time. It's worth it.
What message would you give to the next generation about how to pursue justice and change?
I would tell them sometimes you gotta, upset the setup. Sometimes I wouldn't. I don't like that I jumped on his dais. I'm not proud of that. But sometimes you got to jump on somebody's dais. Sometimes you got to get loud, and sometimes you got to make people uncomfortable. Sometimes you got to shake stuff up. You because that's the only people listen. If I didn't probably jump on that mayor's dais, ain't no telling who would have paid attention to my brother's story the way they did. If I didn't go out there losing my mind, ain't no telling who would have paid attention to what I had to say. My activism is rooted in righteous anger, but it's also rooted in making those who I feel like are comfortable or too comfortable a little bit uncomfortable. And it's not, I was never going to put my hands on Steinberg or nothing like that. I was never going to do that. I never went in intention there like, oh, I'm going to go in there and fight the mayor. I didn't even think I knew he was the mayor until after I did all that, but it was too late at that point. I was grieving, and he said something to me. He said, you were in pain. This is really shortly after, I don't know if you remember, but he told me, he said, you're just in pain. He said, I see, because I apologized to him. And he was like, nah, you were in pain. He said, I see you. You don't have to really apologize. And he asked me if I was good and if I need anything. And I think that's one thing that I love about him is every time I see him, no matter where I see him, no matter where we are, he always checking up on me. He was asking me like, you good, you straight, you all right? And we good like that. Like we see each other, and I respect him a lot. You know what I mean? At the same time, for the young folks, I would tell them, you could do what you do with your art, with your music, with your poetry. And the number one poet in Sacramento, let's get it. We could do what we got to do, to fight for justice. And I think that like my message to the young people would be, and yeah, so you're right. I was before I was jumping on Millions Dias, I was a rapper. My rap name was Pharaoh. You knew me. We were good friends back then. And I had aspirations of being an artist. I asked God for a microphone and a stage and a platform, and he has a sense of humor because he gave it all to me in the worst way. I don't want this microphone. I don't want this stage. I don't want this platform. But that's what God gave me. And I remember I tried to go back to doing music about a year or two after my brother died. And when I started doing music, the first response I got in the comments were, oh, look at him using his dead brother to make music or something like that. And I never really looked at music the same after that. It just never, but actively fighting for my brother, being my brother's keeper, I love it. I do love speaking to students and going to these different colleges and, running the foundation and going to New York and visiting Al Sharpton, those guys. Like, I love the movement work. I love the fight. I love the spirit of Dr. King and Jesse Jackson. I love it. I really do. But it's just, I think, now it's a different field. Politics isn't sexy. He told me that too. He said politics ain't sexy, and it's not at all. It's a lot of stuff you see in the streets, but with people with suit and ties. So it's different. It's a different, but I accept it. I love it. I love fighting for justice, and I love where we are today. And I think we're getting better. We're getting better at this. At communication and coming together. And who would ever thought we'd have this conversation publicly? Nobody probably ever thought that.
Absolutely. For both of y'all, if Stephon Clark could see Sacramento today and hear this conversation, what do you hope he would see in how the city has responded to his life and death and murder?
I hope he would see a committed brother and family working to keep his life and legacy alive. That's what I hope they would see. I think he'd be very proud of you.
Yeah, I would hope that, he sees the same, really, that we love him and we try and keep his life and legacy in a positive light, And that's why we're so focused when we say like the nonviolent peaceful protest, because we don't want his name to go in a negative light. We don't want people to attach crime and all types of negative situations. That's why we talk about the Stephon Clark College Preparatory Middle School, the Stephon Clark Law, AB 392. We bring all these things up because it keeps his name in a positive light. And I think we want that for his legacy.
Absolutely. I think he'd be very proud too. So just in closing, any last reflections on the last 8 years, on this relationship, on this conversation?
Well, for me, being mayor was a journey because I had a political career prior to becoming mayor, where I think I was known fairly as a pretty progressive mayor who did a lot of good things, including raising taxes on millionaires to fund mental health and all kinds of things. Then I got to the mayor's office. Maybe a different stage in life, maybe a different time. And I was seen by young people differently. I was a little bit older, and people didn't really know my history. And I also realized that I had a lot to learn myself, that I had to deepen my own understanding of what it's like to stand in Stevante's shoes, and that I had to dig deeper. And it was painful, and it was hard. But I'm grateful for the experience. I'm grateful that our city has tried to learn the lessons, has invested more money than ever before in the neighborhoods and in young people, and that I tried to paint a different view and vision of what a city should and could be, and what a city government should be about. And I'm not sure it would have gotten this far if it had not been for the tragedy of Stephon Clark, but as importantly, the rightful demand of my community to pay attention, to dig deeper, and to do more.
Yeah, and final thoughts for me and reflecting over the last 8 years is it feels like yesterday, It feels like it just happened, I feel like I was just on his dais 2 nights ago, Hey, that's how real it feels like. And so, for me, just reflecting on the past 8 years is, like I said earlier, slow progress is better than no progress. I think that, the fight continues, at least for me. And reflecting on the last 8 years, like in the next 10 years, next 15 years, I'm going to keep fighting until we get justice and accountability on not some levels, but all levels. So it's hard for me to really reflect even for the last 8 years when we're still in it, We haven't stopped doing the legacy weekend since they started, So it just keeps going for us. So, yeah. And also, I'm glad that me and the mayor got to sit down for the first time and do this on the legacy weekend. I'm glad, you came and were able to moderate it. I'm glad the Sacramento Observer is able to host. I'm just glad we're able to do this. And it's a beautiful day today. And I'm just happy we sat down and got this out the way. So everybody love everybody. That's my story. Sticking to it. Come on now. Everybody love everybody. Hell, we're going to say his name, Stephon Clark. We love you, Stephon. Honor you, Stephon. 8th annual legacy weekend. We got 3 more events to go. and then I'm gonna get some sleep. Amen. We good. Y'all got us. We good. I think me and the mayor said no. We love each other. That's the message here. All right.
Beautiful. Thanks. Thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for being a part of it.